Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Seth. I commonly go by SJ. I'm on the Utah Saint Board of Directors and on the SAINTCON committee. I hope you are enjoying the conference, and I hope you're getting a lot of great information and education as part of your experience here. And I hope that what we're about to talk about for social engineering will give you some of that and also be a little bit of fun. Without further ado, since we're really short on time, let's talk about what is social engineering. First of all, a lot of people, when they think about social engineering, they think of social engineering as some kind of mind jujitsu or the kind of thing in the movie Black Widow. How many of you saw that movie where you have the mind control and you can prevent someone from doing something in your presence? I'm not sure that I have the capacity to do that, but sometimes I believe that I do, so that's fun. Quick quote by an incredible social engineer. How many of you know Christopher Hednagi? One, maybe two of you. It's super hard to see out there with all these lights. These are awesome lights. Everyone must be able to see me really well. So Christopher Hednagi is a wonderful social engineer. He runs the social engineering challenges at DEF CON, has for a long time, has done some amazing work, written several books. If you're looking for something to get started on social engineering, I recommend his stuff. His organization at social-engineer.org also has some great resources, but one of the things that's on there is this definition of social engineering, which I like quite a bit. He said that social engineering is any act that influences a person to take an action that may or may not be in their best interests. When I read that, of course, the linguist in me has a little bit of a problem with that, and that little bit of a problem is if you're going to say it may or may not be, I'm not sure you need to include that. So simplifying that just a little bit, I would say social engineering is simply influence. When you use influence to influence another person, you are essentially doing some social engineering things. And there are, of course, a couple of different kinds of social engineering. There's the great kind of social engineering that helps people to do good things. For those of you who are parents, you probably know this story. I have to teach my children to wash their hands. I do that a lot, and maybe you do too. That's social engineering. I'm trying to influence them to make better decisions and make good habits. Today, during this talk, I'm also going to try to influence you to make certain changes in habits. Fair game, I'm letting you know in advance, so hopefully that resolves a couple of ethical qualms. There are also different kinds of social engineering that maybe are in the less benevolent sorts of things, but the trickster sorts of things. This is so funny, I'm sure all of you are laughing at this sign when you read it that says don't read this, or maybe you're not because you don't think that's very funny. But some of the things that are encountered inside of social engineering end up being this sort of humorous things. And then the last kind of social engineering, of course, is the dangerous kind. And that's the one that most of us tend to worry about and think about when we think about social engineering. With that being said, how many of you are here for story time? I know that there was some confusion on the schedule for Sketch, and the title said one thing and the description said something else, but we are going to talk about stories for social engineering, things that I did for social engineering and ways that I was social engineered, and I hope that you have fun with some of these things. So the first part I want to share with you is, I have to be honest, coming up with these stories is incredibly hard in the middle of a global pandemic. COVID made this really hard for me because usually my MO for doing social engineering tests and experiments is going out and talking to people. And when you don't get to go out and talk to people, it makes that really difficult. Nonetheless, I have a couple of stories that I'd like to share with you, and we're going to start with fast food. How many of you like to eat fast food? All right, some people shameless, that's great. Good for you. I sometimes eat fast food, and sometimes when I go to fast food and I'm placing my order, I notice that as I'm placing my order, I think about it in a different way than the person who's receiving my order. And at times that causes a lot of confusion. So I wanted to experiment and determine whether or not I could use social engineering to improve that experience both for myself and for the employee who was helping me. Next story. As a hacker or a cybersecurity professional, I notice things. And you may notice this too when you go to certain places. You start to see things that you say, wait a minute, that's a problem. I should probably tell someone. For example, when you go to a restaurant or to a store and you see an electronic display that is showing very sensitive information for the organization that's using that. or the operating system of whatever's running on that display. I like to, as a cybersecurity professional, try and do the right thing with responsible disclosure and go to the people who are working at that institution and say, hey, as a cybersecurity professional, as a hacker, if you will, I'd like you to know that I noticed this thing. I noticed that you're displaying the operating system, or there's a problem with your Windows display where you're doing your team viewer to show this thing. Next story. I got a call just a couple weeks ago from an organization claiming to be Rocky Mountain Power. How many of you got that call? A couple of you. Saying that I was late on my payments, and that if I didn't make a payment in the next 45 minutes, my electricity would be shut off. That's a hard thing to deal with, and I certainly felt it.
The hacker's IP.
All right, can we see that?
But
yes.
Here's a vulnerability in the firewall.
Can you pump that volume just a bit?
Yes.
I really appreciate the IP address that starts with 459.
Now we're in.
Never doubted you.
Now let's see who's behind the curtain. Wait, something's wrong.
What is it?
We didn't hack in, we were let in. It's a honeypot. The program is sophisticated. They're using a worm to infect any devices connected to our private network, including our phones. They're listening to us right now. Destroy your phone.
Wait.
You know how to find me.
Who are you?
All right, so if you're into sort of the Panopticon future and TV, you might want to check that show out. How many of you seen that show before? A lot of you, all right. Very interesting situation where somebody has a situation where they think they're in control and they find out they're really not, which may have some bearing on this story, and someone listening in. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the whole idea of mirroring. How many of you are familiar with the concept of mirroring? Lots of you raising your hands right now. You're doing it. Yes, you figured it out. When we're in social situations, we tend to mimic other people, especially when we're getting along really well. And I decided to try that out with my children. They're great social engineers, and wanted to see if I could get some mirroring to happen with them. Next story. Badges for SAINTCON. Everyone has one, hopefully, unless you have one of the temporary passes. You have a badge hanging around your neck. Super awesome badge. Mike and the team did amazing work to make that happen. We got those and started hooking that up to the registration system at possibly the last minute on Monday to get everything ready. It's always down to the wire with SAINTCON. And as a result, we needed to get some devices to be able to sync contact information via NFC onto the badges to make sure it has your contact information. And we didn't have those devices. It was really hard to find them. So we reached out to one of our contacts to see if we could get some help. And then next, the talk that I am giving today was supposed to be something totally different. It was going to be me walking out on the street, talking to people, and seeing if I could get them to give to me certain information in a social engineering engagement as flags. We had a list of a number of flags. There were 5 of them, including one of those which is handing your cell phone to me in an unlocked state. While we were unable to do the video part of this, I was able to do this with a number of people to see how those results turned out, and I think it was pretty fascinating.
It comes with a price.
I gave
You
them
turn the
the
volume
wrong
up a
warning.
little bit.
I should have told them to run as fast as they can. Run and hide because the monsters are coming. The human race.
Those are the people I represent. I did it on their behalf.
And I should have stopped you.
What does that make you, Doctor? Another alien threat?
Don't challenge me, Harriet Jones, because I'm a completely new man. I could bring down your government with a single word.
You're the most remarkable man I've ever met. But I don't think you're quite capable of that.
No, you're right. Not a single word. Just 6.
I don't think so.
6 words.
Stop it!
6. Don't you think she looks tired?
What did he say?
Well, nothing, really.
What did he say?
Nothing, I don't know.
Doctor! Doctor, what was that? What did he say? What did you say, Doctor? Doctor!
All right, any Whovians out there? So I have a friend, really good friend, who is very much into Doctor Who. And we had lengthy conversations about this particular segment. And we thought, isn't it interesting that he centered on 6 words? And so we decided to investigate how many words does it take to achieve a certain outcome, and can you minimize that? We wanted to find out how many words does it take, and can you reduce the number of words and still get the same outcome? And then lastly, but perhaps most importantly, I wanted to try an experiment in social engineering for kindness. A lot of social engineering experiments end up being, at the least, trying to be benevolent, and at the worst, perhaps shaming or embarrassing people. And I wanted to find out, can we use social engineering to create some sort of kindness-driven scenario? So those are all the stories that we're going to talk about. We're going to shift gears for just a moment and talk about the basics of social engineering. There are a number of components that are generally, I think, helpful in social engineering situations. Preparation, framing, elicitation, triggers, motivation, and execution. We're going to go through each of these pretty quickly because we're running a little bit low on time. So preparation. To prepare for a social engineering situation, you want to make sure that you're using everything that is available to you, and that means observing everything that you see very carefully. Observing the facial expressions, the hand placements, all of those things. You have a fantastic gift of sight, if you have sight, and you can use that to your advantage. The next is listening, making sure that you're listening to everything that's being said, making sure that you're careful about which words are being used and how they're being used and in what context. Those 2 senses end up being, I would say, perhaps the most important in social engineering contexts. Most of the social engineering that I engage with ends up being either body language driven or spoken language driven. There are some situations where it can also be digital language driven through email or SMS and things like that, and many social engineers prefer that. It's not really my cup of tea. And then next, doing your research. In advance of any social engineering engagement, it is best if you can identify what things you want to discover, what things you want to achieve, and what are the components to that? What are the things that another person might know, see, or believe about that? Next, perhaps also not my favorite thing to do, but throwing things in the waste bin and putting them out on the street is fair game. If that's something that gets you access to that piece of information, please consider that. I can say that the thing that I have found far more palatable for me personally is the notion to save the planet and recycle. I have found in a number of institutions here in the state, people who are very good-natured trying to reuse paper that they have printed out, perhaps sensitive information on, and putting it out in places where I can see it. I will grab that and then show it to them later to let them know that that's a problem. With all of these pieces of information and preparation, generally what you want to do is create a profile for the target of this social engineering experiment. Some of those things for more important and heavier-handed social engineering tactics require a more complex and detailed profile, whereas perhaps just getting someone to hand you their phone on the street is a simpler profile. Any questions about that as far as preparation? Does that make sense to everybody? I know we're breezing through this really quick. All right, next, framing. How many of you have heard of the concept of a worldview? A couple of you. As you look at the world around you, you look at it in a certain way. And that's great. It helps you to keep things in context, and those mental heuristics keep you sane. It's a good thing. But that also means that you might have certain blind spots as part of your worldview. So as far as framing, I like to think of this as your worldview is a VR headset. You're not always looking at the world exactly as it is. And many of the VR headsets, I don't know how many of you have an Oculus, but when you walk out of a certain area inside of that, it will shut down the virtual reality view and turn it into the camera view automatically. When you branch outside of your safety zone, it tries to save you. And that's great, because ultimately, if you don't have that sort of protection, you can injure yourself or others. I don't know how many of you have had that experience, but I've seen plenty of people who have been playing some VR games. Someone walks through, and the person playing the game has no idea about their surroundings, and they will get hit or injured in some way. That's obviously not something that's desirable, and ideally, clearing out of that area is important. Why all this context of VR? Well, when you're looking inside of your worldview, if I can reshape that worldview to gloss over certain things, that prevents you from paying attention to those things. And from a social engineering context, that implements influence, and that influence is distracting your attention away from something else. Does that make sense? All right, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about triggers, and not the age-old movie stars, but the triggers that happen inside of your mind. Whenever you are in a tense situation, you might have for yourself what is commonly referred to as a fight or flight response. You've probably felt that, and that is a natural response for the human brain. Animals have some sort of reactions like that too. You can see the fight and you can see the flight. That happens through the limbic system. And this little highlighted area on this brain scan is the amygdala. For those of you who have done any study in social engineering, you may have heard of the term called amygdala hijacking. This is where people will use emotional responses where the trigger is sent to the amygdala, and the amygdala, as an emotional response, triggers that fight or flight. And as an emotional response, it doesn't trigger reason. So you have all these different inputs, and with those inputs, you get different kinds of outputs. Your brain is a highly complex thing. It has the capacity to think amazing things. I'm sure you've learned and thought amazing things here at SAINTCON in all the things that you have done. And when you're sitting there thinking through with your rational brain, you have far more capability to remember those things and to think clearly about those things. When you're in a situation where you have an emotional response, those things tend to go away. And there are two reasons why. The first one is that the neural pathway from the inputs to the amygdala is faster than every other part of your brain. That pathway is so well established that you get emotional responses far faster, and it will attempt to, at certain scenarios, shut down other parts of the brain to trigger that fight or flight response to benefit you for your safety and survival. You may have had a situation in your life where that was greatly beneficial, where it did actually save your life. But there are also a number of situations where when that occurs, it's not really that beneficial. It actually prevents you from taking a step outside of that beautiful VR landscape and realizing you're about to hit something or someone. Now, it's important to understand that because when you're trying to trigger a social engineering influence in someone else, or someone's trying to do that to you, you need to know that is a trigger that they will use on a consistent basis. Being able to use your amygdala or amygdala hijacking to circumvent all of your wonderful rational thinking. Any questions about that?
Can you give an example of that in use?
Absolutely. So in the story where I got called by someone saying your power bill is overdue and your power will be turned off in 45 minutes. What happens instantly? I'm thinking that my slides just turned off. I'm thinking in that moment, I'm in trouble because I need this. It's cold outside. It's hot outside. I need to turn on my lights, right? My children are home, all kinds of things. Like the moment that hits me, I understand I've got 45 minutes to figure this out. That is a fantastic trigger that goes straight to my emotion, right? I'm not thinking through, well, when was the last time that I paid my bill? What form of payment did I use? Those are all rational kinds of thoughts. But thinking, oh my goodness, I might not have power, that's emotional. And that trigger is far faster. Does that make sense? Other questions about that? How many of you have felt that or can recognize that? You remember having that experience where, oh my goodness, I had an emotional overload and I couldn't think of that. Great. How many of you have had that experience where you had like emotional overload to the point of shock and you couldn't even think clearly for a while after that? Usually serious injuries, accidents, those kinds of things happen. I remember having one of those and I'm thinking, I am just not okay. Like my rational brain is still sitting somewhere else until this whole thing calms down. I can't go anywhere or do anything. I just need somebody to be with me. That's okay. That is a human brain thing. With that being said, it is important for you to understand that that is a tactic that people are going to use for social engineering. Yes, ma'am? Yes, there is, and it comes with practice, right? When you can perhaps hone some of those emotional responses to trigger a certain other pathway in your brain, and we're probably going to get to the neuroplasticity stuff later, but I guess we'll talk about it now. Being able to rewire your brain to say, my emotional response for this thing means that. And that way you can start to use that as a benefit to you instead of shutting down all rational thinking. It can actually trigger, okay, now that I have this emotional response, I need to do the rational thinking to solve this problem. Does that help? Other questions? All right. Next, I want to talk a little bit about motivations for human beings. Here's a list of some of my favorites. In the background, you can see the Utah monolith. How many of you heard about the Utah monolith? How many of you went out to see it? Okay. There was crazy focus on this thing for like a week. And that's the bottom one on the list, social proof. When other people care about something, we have this innate desire to care about that thing too. It's weird, right? And it seems weird talking about it, but if you think, did I follow those news stories about the Utah monolith? Maybe, right? Am I really interested in some hunk of metal out in the desert? Your rational thinking says no. But your social thinking says, well, everyone else is doing it. Why not? Right? Authority. When you see someone who might be a law enforcement authority or your boss, will you act differently around them? Probably. You don't want to get fired, right? Social engineers use this very often in phishing attempts to say, I want you to transfer this money from this account to this account, says your boss. Now, once again, in context of this discussion, you're like, oh, Seth, I would never do that, right? You would never do that. Well, when you're in that moment and the emotional response comes up, you might not get to think that. And that's why it's important to prepare for this. Avoidance. People do things to avoid certain consequences. Rather than suffering some sort of emotional distress, they'd rather just not participate in this thing. A lot of people, for their motivations, have commitment and consistency. I'll be honest, this one works great with me. I love to think that what I say is what I will do. and my children know this. They absolutely use this to own me. They say, Dad, you promised you would read 2 books tonight. And I have to think back and say, yes, I did. I will do that, right? Concession. When you give something up, you are more likely to give something else up. It's just how your brain works. Fear, and this might tie into some of the authority, but other kinds of things as well. Perhaps the fear of injury or harm. Fear is perhaps one of the most powerful motivators on this list because of its tying to emotional response and the fight or flight syndrome. It is also the worst motivator from a social engineering perspective to use. This will destroy relationships. I would encourage you, as your budding social engineers going out in the world to do incredible things with your social engineering skills that you learned today, maybe stay away from that one. Unless you really want people to hate you, maybe stay away from that one. Can you tell someone, if you don't do this right now, you will get fired? Yes, you can. And will that incentivize them very strongly to go do that thing? Yes. And when they find out later that you are making that up, will they hate you? Probably, right? Greed. The Nigerian prince scam has been around for a long dang time. And yet, some of its iterations continue to be present. Why? It really sounds appealing to be able to get something possibly for nothing, or for just doing this small help to somebody else. When you feel obligated, you're willing to do something for someone else. If you feel it's your duty as part of being a citizen or being a member of a particular identity group, you will be obliged and feel motivation to do certain things. Rapport, you do things for people that you like. How many of you are liking me right now? Kinda. Some of you, okay. Well, we'll get to that part later on when I make a request. Reciprocity, when someone does something for you, when they do a favor for you, you are more likely to do a favor back for them. Think in your mind for just a moment about the last time someone did you a favor. If they asked you for a favor of somewhat equivalent value today, right now, would you do it? Yeah, you would. Why? Because they did you a favor. It just makes sense, right? Well, sometimes in some contexts it does, and in some contexts it doesn't. And then we already talked about social proof, but scarcity. When you think that something might run out, you are more incentivized to do something about it. This isn't just necessarily the toilet paper scare, but others as well, right? How many of you booked a hotel for this, and when you were there, you saw some message that said, 5 people have booked this room in the last hour? Could be 5 people from all over the planet for the next 30 years who booked that room, but it makes it feel like they're about to run out, right? And they don't show how many rooms are left. No, they won't show you that. It's this creation of artificial scarcity. It's the Disney vault of hoteling, right? That feeling of scarcity incentivizes you to do things that you might not normally do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about execution. Very often, if you want to be really great at social engineering, this is the step that's the hardest. This is the step that's the hardest to get into. And honestly, I would say if you want to get into social engineering, just go do it. Ideally, do it with someone who's willing to play along, but not necessarily someone who knows what your objectives are, or they'll just grant it to you because they're friends with you and you have great rapport. But make sure that you try it out. There are a couple of different types of social engineering attacks, and I want to talk about those as well. For social engineering attacks, there are, in my opinion, 2 specific attacks from a harmful perspective. The first one is opportunism. Sometimes social engineering attacks are tuned to you just because someone needs a target. You will do as well as any other target. And sometimes those are targeted toward you or your organization in particular. Those are the ones that are the most dangerous because those are the people who will invest far more time in trying to harm you and your organization. So, you should also know the attack vectors for social engineering. There will be attacks coming in possibly via email for phishing. How many of you have seen a phishing email before? You'll see another one, maybe even before the end of the day. How many of you have received a phone call like me? All right, how about browsers? Trying to get you to click on that link. All right, USB. If you see a USB drive on the ground, don't pick it up, don't plug it in. And in person, which is my personal favorite. I want you to practice these things. I want you to practice responding to these things. And to your question in particular, how do you get out of that amygdala hijacking? And the only answer is you need to practice. Neuroplasticity is this process in which your brain can grow and rewire itself. But it only does that through practice. When someone calls up and asks you to do something, you need to have a standard operating procedure inside your own mind of how do I handle that? And then every time someone calls up and asks you to do something, you need to run that little playbook inside your head over and over and over again. If you do that, when the moment comes that you find yourself in a situation where someone is actually perpetrating a social engineering attack against you, your little thing will kick in and say, wait a minute, when this thing happens, run that code. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? All right, so let's talk a little bit about story time. Let's close up these stories. Fast food. I wanted to find a way to use my fast food scenario to improve my experience. And so I went to the fast food situation and said, hey, listen, I'd like to order this thing. And they said, no, that's not what I'm asking for right now. I would ask special questions to identify what is it that you see on your screen, because I don't get to see their screen. I'm not working at the fast food restaurant. But over a period of about 4 or 5 visits, I was able to get fast food done right. And I was able to get it done fast too, because I knew exactly how to answer every single one of their questions with the right information every single time. It was fantastic. And my order didn't get screwed up. It was just simple and easy to do. As a hacker, going into people's organizations and saying, look, I noticed this thing, your information is being exposed. I expected very commonly for people to say, oh no, a hacker. Feel like they're in some sort of slasher film or something like that. But really what I mostly got was, let me get back to my job. I don't know if this is part of like the whole COVID thing. It used to be the other way. People were absolutely afraid of me, but not anymore. People just want to go back to doing their own thing. With the situation of my power bill that was overdue, I would love to tell you that I was doing this. Like, yes, I am that guy and I'm going to own you. Got to be honest. And maybe a little bit ashamed. But it didn't work out that way. The only thing that was my lifesaver was that rut, that pathway that I carved in my brain through neuroplasticity over and over and over again. How did I do it? I know that when someone calls me to ask about something, to do any favor, to transfer any money, I say, thank you very much, I'll talk to you later, click, and then I go log into my website with my password to check that. It turns out that in this particular situation, I actually had a positive balance with Rocky Mountain Power, which is sort of hard to do. I don't know how we got to that, but my point is, it definitely wasn't true, and I wasn't saved because I'm some genius about social engineering and I've done this talk for years, or I've done all these experiments and I know how all this works, or my brain's so much better. It's not. My brain is the same kind of brain that you have. What's great about this is I was able to train that brain to understand even when I'm in a situation where I'm freaking out because, oh my goodness, I'm about to lose power. I was able to say, well, the solution to this problem, route this, run this code. I'm going to go log into the website right now. Now, it helps to do that in a lot of other situations where it's low pressure. It helps to do that in a lot of other situations where there's low pressure. But you can't always do that, so I would say start today. Next, with our mirroring exercise, trying with my children, I want them to mirror things and practice that mirroring. Well, I did that, and I did that really well. I did that so well that at one point, my wife turned to me and said, when you say, the flavor for this dinner is so incredible, do you notice those exact same words coming out of your children's mouths? And I have to admit, she had a point. It was kind of like that. And maybe I've created a bit of a monster, I don't know. All right. Let's talk about the badges. We had over 1,000 people checking in to need badges, and we needed devices really quickly to be able to transport the NFC information for every single one of you onto your badge. And I would like to say that we did that pretty great. However, we would like to give some great thanks to our hero here, and this is not a picture of our actual hero, but his name is Tristan. Tristan absolutely, positively social engineered me here at this conference. He was one of the people who was called as a contact from someone who lives up in Logan, Utah, which, for those of you who don't know, is at least 2 hours away by driving, a long ways away. So that's a 4-hour round trip. He packaged up a bunch of devices, drove all the way down here, waited here while I tested it, and sold us devices that we needed to make this conference run. So big round of applause for Tristan, who's not even here. Thank you, Tristan. Tristan did such a great job of social engineering. Not only did he sell me a number of devices for whatever cut I hope he got, he was also able to get my email address from me as a measure of gratitude. So really excited about that. Next story for social engineering. Going out on the street asking people, can I get some information from you, such as your email address, and can I see your phone unlocked to show you some things? I tried this on 17 different people, and I'm happy to report we have a 100% success rate. If you think that that's abnormal, you don't understand what we're talking about at all. It's not that these people are foolish or stupid. They're not. They're normal people. What's great about this is to understand they were put in a situation where either I was out of their frame of reference, and so they're wearing those little goggles for their VR thinking, oh, this is a great scenario, when in fact, it's probably not. And it's very easy to say, well, I'm sort of doing some sort of amygdala hijacking to say, are you concerned about your security? Let me look at your phone and tell you what it looks like, right? Being able to do that makes that a challenge for some people, and there's some level of being distracted. When you're distracted by something else, your focus can generally only be, unless you're super powered something, on one thing. If that one thing is something that I choose and not something that you choose, that can be a problem. Next story. How many of you know who this character is from Doctor Who? Anyone? Yes.
Oh, you're going to put me on the spot for it?
Yes. Who knows? Every single time holds up the card. What does she say? Anyone? We're going to look it up. How about Harriet Jones? She's the prime minister in the earlier clip. And Doctor Who says he can take down her government with 6 words. Pretty bold statement. Well, my friend and I decided to make a game out of it. We call it the Harriet Jones game or the 6 words game. Either name is fine. And we identify and created profiles about a number of different people to identify what are the things we know about them. As a social engineering engagement for our common acquaintances, we put this in a Google Sheets or Google Docs and put together these profiles and decided, can we create a situation where 6 words is enough to get an outcome? And the answer, of course, is yes. And the yes is for cookies. When you are in a social scenario and you bring cookies, would you like to stop people from taking another cookie? You can, with just 6 words. I suppose it's okay for you to have another. I suppose you can have another. If you say those words, it makes them think, oh my goodness, that wasn't the plan. Am I taking too many? Am I taking something from someone else? And that social pressure hits in. I probably shouldn't take another cookie. In fact, if you say it at the right moment, you can get it while the cookie is in their hand and they'll put it back on the plate. Now, that's all in good fun, but let's talk seriously. I want to suggest that the most important experiment that I did with social engineering over the past little while is the experiment in kindness, and finding ways to use that social engineering to generate sincere joy for the people that I interact with. And that comes down to my request for you. On the little playlist inside your head, I'm going to make a request for a song. If you are into trite phrases, here's the one for you. Do one thing every day that scares you, and the thing that I want you to do today is social engineer someone. So, I'm going to order something slightly off the menu, and that is, I want you to generate some happiness. I want you to find someone today where you can use some of the tactics that you have learned today and create a situation that makes someone happy. I think you'll find that you have a superpower. You can be a superhero that no one expected. In the world today, especially in a post-pandemic world, we have a lot of people who are struggling, and they need someone who can be that kind of superhero. I believe that you can be that kind of superhero. I believe that you can create that kind of happiness and joy in people all around you, and all it takes is practicing these things. That's all I have for you today, so thank you, and I can take some questions if you'd like. Yes? Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And you see how quick that amygdala was like, oh yeah, agreed, I love that, praise, yes, thank you. I didn't even have to think about it.
What about the 3% that are sociopaths?
What do you mean, what about the 3% who are sociopaths?
So, in your models where they want to do good, they want to be benevolent, they want to receive happiness, their amygdala works. You look at CEOs for most companies, and I think the current guess is like 60 to 70% of them are in fact sociopaths, where a lot of these social engineering tricks not only wouldn't work, they're immune to them.
So that's a great question. First of all, there's a fantastic TED Talk, I think it's a TED Talk, it's a TED Talk, thank you, a TED Talk about sociopaths. Fascinating. I'm not sure if any of it's true. I can't vouch for any of that information, but I would suggest that you watch that because the definition of sociopath may be up for grabs. With that being said, if you think that you can't social engineer a CEO into something, you've never met a CEO. Even the psychopaths, I don't care if your amygdala functions in a different way. I'd love to meet you, and we can have lunch sometime, and we'll see how that really works. Because, I got to be honest, I study this stuff all the time. And in this talk, I talked about ways where I was absolutely owned by my children, by some person calling me on the phone. I know this stuff. I know this stuff. And it doesn't matter. If you haven't practiced that way to escape, you're in trouble. At some point, that will come to your doorstep. Maybe that's a little bit, alarmist, but I'm sorry, that's kind of the way that I see it, right? There will be someone who's going to call you and try and get that information from you. It's going to happen. So be prepared. And if you happen to be a sociopath, maybe the mechanism for getting in is a little bit different, but the general structure of the brain probably remains the same. The function might be slightly different, but I don't think it's going to be significantly different. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, over here.
How do you gauge your expertise and your reaction, your practice on it when you get a call like that? Know how well you've done, how quickly you switch that, and check the website, make sure, how do you know that you practiced enough to know that you're good enough?
How do you know if you practiced enough to know that you're good enough? The answer to that question definitively is when someone calls and tries to own you, you make the right choice. Outside of that, I don't know. The reality is you want to do enough tabletop exercises inside your own head to make that work, and I don't know what that number is. Some of the greatest social engineers that I know have had situations where they have been social engineered. So I don't know that we have the upper bound limit. If you've done this 1,000,000 times, then you're safe. I don't know that it works like that. What I can say is when you establish the neural pathways, the stronger those pathways are, the less likely you are to be susceptible to it. English. Any other questions? Yes, right here. Do I troll people with emails or phone calls? Thanks, babe. Yes, but not frequently. I'm far more of an in-person kind of thing, and actually, in this conference in 2018, I was asked sort of that question of someone asked, do you do threat modeling with people around the dinner table at Thanksgiving dinner with your family? And I was like, no, but that's a great idea. So in 2019, I actually gave a talk about doing that very thing. I'm interested in doing that, but I also, this is a really, I would say, strenuous ethical concern for me, because when you learn how to do these things, you can absolutely exploit people. And I have serious concerns with that. I don't think that's okay. I don't think that you should do that either. I would encourage you to be ethical and maybe introduce yourself to some of the ethics around social engineering. There's some great things to learn about that. We didn't talk a whole lot about that today, but yeah, and there are some legal ramifications for that too. Certain kinds of pretexting or sending emails can be illegal. So before you jump all the way into that and say, I'm going to make a splash in the world, make sure you have the right authorization to do that, or you can end up in some serious trouble. Does that answer your question? Other questions?
I'm here in the back. Here.
Oh, I can see you now. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. So my question is just, you said even master social engineers have been socially engineered. So what's the threshold? Like, because if you ask me, oh, could I just make a phone call on your phone? I totally would hand you my phone unlocked and everything. So what's the threshold?
What's the threshold? The answer is I don't know. I've never met someone who was completely impervious to that. What I have done is met people who, in a specific situation, were impervious to that. All right? If you say, well, the thing that I'm worried about is the information on my phone that someone might be able to get to, so I'm not going to hand my phone to someone unlocked, you can practice that, and you can be the world's greatest expert on never handing your phone to anyone unlocked. That's a task that you can solve. If you're trying to say, like, can I make myself impervious to social engineering in general? I think the answer to that is definitively no. However, you can make it better by practicing all the little pieces of it. Does that make sense? That's a sort of answer. I'm not trying to be evasive, it's just that's kind of the way it is. Yes, go ahead.
This isn't really a question, but just follow up to what you said. I expect that if you could make yourself completely impervious to social engineering, you would no longer fit in with society because you couldn't adapt.
I couldn't say. I don't know. But some might say that I'm already having struggles with that, so it is what it is. All right, other questions? We got one more minute.
Yeah.
Yes? Resources to learn more about social engineering. I would say Christopher Hadnagy's site, social-engineer.org, has some great resources on it. There's some interesting Wikipedia articles on it. There are some great TED Talks on it as well. I would say it's a great thing to do some research on it and learn about it, but to be honest, nothing works quite the same way as being engaged in it, whether you're the target or the perpetrator, so to speak. Whether you're the engineer or the engineered, it doesn't matter. Like, being able to practice through that, and if you have someone in your life who's willing to go through that sort of chaos with you, that could be really fun. I mean, I talked about my friend where we put together these ideas and profiles about people, and we tried to figure out how do we get someone to do something in 6 words. We did it, and we're a whole lot better communicators because of it. It's not just that we were able to get people to put cookies down, but we became better communicators, and we're better understanding of like the words that we're using. We're more careful about it now. So there are other benefits to it as well. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time.